Welcome to our Sunday feature. Tonight we premiere The Road to War, a major new series that commemorates the 50th anniversary of the outbreak of the Second World War.
And now it has come to us to stand alone in the breach and face the worst that the tyrant's might and enmity can do.
Britain was unprepared for war. As the army retreated across the English Channel from the beaches of Dunkirk, many must have blamed the guilty men, the politicians who'd rejected vigorous rearmament in favor of placating the dictators. For the next half-century, Britain's policy of appeasement was remembered with shame. But what brought Britain to the verge of defeat was not the guilt of the few. It was the collective illusion of a nation. 20 years before the retreat from Dunkirk, the body of an unidentified casualty of the First World War was brought from the battlefield of France across the English Channel to Britain. Borne on a gun carriage, the coffin was drawn through London, and in the presence of King George V, the unknown soldier was given a state funeral in Westminster Abbey. In 4.5 years, Britain had lost 1 million men. Never before had there been such slaughter.
The shock to the system, the national system of the First War, had really gone very, very, very deep. It's almost impossible now, looking back, to think how deep it has gone. But that was the truth of the matter. And the trench warfare of the last 4 years of the First War had really bitten into everybody's soul. And they remember, of course, there was to be no more war. It was the war to end all wars.
Such a horrible war. The people that got killed, I mean, our own personal example, my mother lost her two brothers, one 19 in the Somme, and Uncle Arthur was a regular soldier just home from India. He didn't get home, actually. They diverted him to France, and he went through the battles, early battles and that, and he got killed. And such a lot of people went. I mean, such a lot of young men were killed, and the Somme and that I think people were really horrified and thought they'd never have another war. People really didn't want it.
In those days, Britain was a superpower. The Union Jack flew proudly over 1/5 of the surface of the globe. Her imperial possessions contained 1/4 of the world's population, but the war had brought her close to bankruptcy. To cheer people up, the government organized an exhibition at Wembley. Its theme was the Empire.
It seems to me that someone must have said, now we've got this terrible war over, we must do something to promote business, trade, to let the world know that the British Empire is still alive and well, and to boost morale generally. And what better than a British Empire exhibition?
The brand new stadium was the setting for the royal opening ceremony. mass bands and choirs were conducted by the composer, Edward Elgar.
We were, of course, extremely patriotic people in those days, and the British Empire was part of our life. Patriotism ran through everything, like a thread through everything, through your school, through your family, through society. We thought that the empire was a force for good in the world, a benign force. And we thought that the British were a little bit better than most people. In fact, the British, even working men, who at that time, many of them had rather a poor standard of life, were nevertheless intensely patriotic and thought that generally that the British was as good as 10 foreigners.
To fight the war, Britain had mobilized 5 million men, all but a few were discharged. Despite the demands of imperial defense, there was no money to maintain large armed services. And besides, Britain, like other victorious powers, was determined to disarm, especially now that no conceivable enemy existed. The army was the first to be emasculated. To justify the cuts, the government adopted what it called the 10-year rule, an assumption for the purposes of military planning that peace would last at least 10 years. The Navy, Britain's guardian of the imperial sea lanes, was drastically diminished. By the start of the 1930s, Britain was a weaker naval power in relation to her rivals than she had been since the 17th century, when her fleet had been defeated by the Dutch. Britain's most modern service, the Air Force, was all grounded.
When the First World War ended, the Royal Air Force was both the largest individual air force in the world and the only independent air force in existence. It had 22,000 aircraft on charge, 1,600 of them in actual action on the Western Front. And then dramatically, in 2 years, it had reduced from that 22,000 on charge to only 120 serviceable aircraft in the whole of the Royal Air Force. Tremendous drop. And aircraft, of course, were being scrapped, chopped up, burned in every direction. You could buy a SE-5 fighter for £5 and a 504 trainer for joyriding for 10.
Weakened by disarmament, the British put their trust in the League of Nations, set up at Geneva. The League was to settle disputes by arbitration, and in the last resort would fall back on what it called collective security. In extreme cases, this meant joint military action by member nations. But Britain's immediate concern was the preservation of its highly vulnerable empire. By the 1930s, she was scarcely strong enough to protect even the British Isles against a threat from Europe, and that was only a first commitment. Another lay along the Mediterranean and Suez Canal, on the sea lane to the brightest jewel in the imperial crown, India. Further east, and dangerously exposed, were Burma, Malaya, Hong Kong. The empire was hugely overstretched. It was in Asia that aggression began. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, nominally part of China. Japan had been a British ally since the start of the century, but in 1922, under pressure from America, Britain had ended the alliance. With that, Japan became a potential enemy. But an even greater threat was emerging much nearer home, in Europe.
Hitler gets a tremendous ovation when leaving for his first cabinet meeting.
Hitler came to power on a promise to tear up the peace treaties and restore Germany's role as a major power in Europe. In principle, the British were sympathetic. There was a widespread feeling that Germany had been treated too harshly after the war.
From across the way, Hitler appears at his window, and another milestone is marked in Germany's political history.
I think people were concerned, but I can't say that they felt alarmed at that stage. I think there was a certain feeling in the country that the Germans, one thing they do is love playing at soldiers. And as they had no soldiers, they took the the brown shirts of the Nazi movement was a good alternative. But I don't think anybody suspected that they would break out into something as terrible as they did.
To the British government, a coalition of the Conservative, Labour and Liberal parties, the threat building up abroad was a long way off. The only pressing concern was the desperate state of Britain's economy, the result of the World Depression.
The threats that were building up abroad were rather remote, but the economic crisis was immediate. Something had to be done almost overnight. Otherwise, we were told, not just by fools and people who wanted to frighten us, but by leading economists, the financial correspondents of every newspaper, appalling crisis is going to affect the British people, which will have dreadful effects. That was an immediate thing, and therefore, for the time being, all the intention was concentrated on that problem, rather than on the developing European situation with its threat of war.
The wartime government had promised the survivors of the heroes to live in. The pledge was not fulfilled. Industry had lost ground to foreign competition, and in the early 1930s, 1 in 5 of the working population was unemployed. Millions of families lived in abject poverty.
So you saw real hunger. I mean, I'd been really hungry. I'm not talking about starving in the sense of peoples of Africa, but I'd known hunger pangs and not known where the next meal was coming from. And I'd seen the desperation on my mother's face as to how she's going to feed 5 children and a husband. We used to go out and buy 4 pennyworth of scrag end of lamb, and with that my mother would make a big succulent stew which would last us 2 or 3 days. And I remember coming home from school one day being really very hungry, and there on the stove was this big stew. And my mother put a lid on it and started taking it out of the house. And I said, "Where are you going?" She said she was going to give it to Mrs. Bushell, a little further down the road. And I said, "But I'm hungry." And I remember she slapped my face. She said, "You're hungry, but now starving."
The strong man of the cabinet was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Melbourne. At heart, he was a social reformer, dedicated to uplift, prosperity and beating the Depression. He'd come to prominence as Lord Mayor of Birmingham, where his particular pride was a housing estate at Wheelie Castle, built to replace the worst of the slums. In 1933, Chamberlain went back to Birmingham for a special ceremony. The number of new council houses had reached 40,000.
It was just like a little palace because we'd had nothing, you see, down there, and the house was dark down there where we'd get lights in and all like that. And it was marvellous to think we got our own things, we got our own toilets and bathroom, and we could move. And if we wanted to wash every day, we could do, and all like that. And it sent such a godsend, you know, after waiting 9 years.
I can remember when most every night at 10 we sang an old refrain as we wandered in the moonlight down Sunnyside Lane. We heard the merry lark, and if the night was dark, I'd feel a kiss again. As we wandered in the moonlight down Sunnyside Lane.
Must be strong and healthy. They must command an income sufficient to maintain themselves and their families, at least in a minimum state of comfort. They should be able to cultivate taste for beautiful things, whether in nature or in art, and to open their minds to the wisdom that is to be found in books.
Chamberlain's priorities were soon to be upset. In 1934, a high-level government committee reviewed the state of Britain's defences. The report recommended greater spending on defence and the creation of an expeditionary force able to fight on the continent. It drew attention to German rearmament and identified Hitler as the ultimate potential enemy. In 1935, Hitler had been in power for 2 years, and the resurgence of German militarism was causing unease. Nevertheless, the peace movement in Britain commanded mass support for its campaign against war. Propaganda films denounced rearmament.
I'd fight tomorrow if I thought a war would end war, but that's what they told my father in 1914, and we're no better off now.
When there's a quarrel between two people, the police are called in to settle it. Why can't the League of Nations be strong enough to settle disputes between two nations?
I was in the last war, and I thought that was going to be the end of it. Now, here we are again, back exactly where we started. Why can't the governments of the world get together to make war impossible?
Write to your MP.
The peace movement launched a successful petition.
We got over 11 million signatures for the peace petition, which is a significant number of the adults in this country. And that was the first beginning, I think, of the movement which was then to take over the 30s, feeling against war. The fear was there, ticking away like a bomb all through the 30s. I think the peace petition began to make people feel and think about it. There we were marching and fighting to stop war, to demand that the government should form a pact with Russia and others to stop Hitler. Yet at the same time in our hearts, I think there was a realization that the machinery was in motion. It couldn't be stopped. That bomb was going to explode one day.
Neville Chamberlain urged the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, to come out for limited rearmament. But 1935 was an election year, and Baldwin was careful to reassure the voters.
Above all, we desire to go on working to maintain world peace and strengthen the League of Nations. But it is clear from recent events that both our own influence in the world and that of the League itself will be weakened unless we make good the gaps in our defenses. I will never stand for a policy of great armament, and I give you my word, and I think you can trust me by now, that our defense program will be no more than is sufficient to make our country safe and enable us to fulfill our obligations. That much we must have.
When Italy invaded Abyssinia, the need to strengthen Britain's defences became indisputable. Italy had been an ally, and Mussolini's friendship was vital to British control of the Mediterranean and thus to the Empire's defence. A further threat now developed in Germany, where Hitler marched 3 battalions of the Wehrmacht into the Rhineland. It was a clear breach of treaties, but it was not unexpected. Britain and France had spent months discussing their response. In the event, they did nothing. In the words of Anthony Eden, given Germany's strength and power of mischief in Europe, it was in Britain's interest to conclude a settlement with Hitler while he was still in the mood. It was a classic definition of appeasement.
I think that we should have stopped Hitler probably when he invaded the Rhineland. But there was a feeling in Britain certainly that the peace treaty had treated Germany unjustly. There was rather reluctance, therefore, to intervene on that particular issue. The French showed no sign of intervening whatever. And so I think the hope was, and again, it was a false hope, that if Hitler was allowed to reoccupy the Rhineland, that would be sufficient, and that would be the end of his demands. That feeling was wrong.
The opposition to rearmament was gradually crumbling, as Chamberlain noted at the annual conference of the Conservative Party.
There could be no doubt in the minds of any members of His Majesty's government who were present of the determination of the great audience to see the gaps in our defences filled at the earliest possible moment. As Chancellor of the Exchequer, I feel greatly encouraged and heartened by what I heard this morning.
Parliament has decided that Britain shall spend 1,500 millions on arms in the next 5 years. Not directed against any one country, said the Chancellor, but because of our vast responsibilities in all parts of the world, and as a measure for the preservation of peace. This means no remission in taxation, but it gives security. Even more than that, it will reduce the figures of unemployment. Security will bring prosperity.
It was Chamberlain who made rearmament policy. The Air Force was given priority. Bombers and fighters would form a deterrent to enemy action against the British Isles. The fear of bombing in these years almost amounted to an obsession. Feature films added to people's fears. Even the service chiefs joined in. There is the possibility, they wrote, of air attacks so continuous and concentrated that a few weeks of bombing might so undermine the morale of our civilian population as to make it impossible for the government to continue a war.
People were frightened of bombing. That and the gas attacks. I know I thought about it quite earlier on about the bombing, and people used to say, oh, with the world, what you come down bombing out of existence or something like that. People were really frightened of it.
Is London, the world's biggest city, defenseless against attack from the air? RAF pilots have been giving the metropolis an object lesson.
The power of the bomber was constantly pushed right through the late 1920s through into the 1930s. And all sorts of bogus statistics were traded about by which London was going to be bombed into ruins within a week, and 3 million people were going to be milling about in the countryside, and so on. And so you had a kind of conspiracy, if you like, of air marshals, defense pundits, and pacifists all saying that the next war was going to start with a colossal German strike at London and other industrial cities.
The response of Parliament was to vote more money for the Air Force. A specially built factory at Acox Green in Birmingham. To meet the shortage of skilled labour, aircraft factories were set up in the strongholds of the motor industry. Bernard Smith left the Rover Car Company to help set up one of the new shadow factories.
The shadow factory scheme was a brilliant idea. It was a unique way of using the resources of an existing motor industry to immediately double, for example, the output of the Bristol Aeroplane Engine Company. The government were building these shadow factories, not that they very seriously thought that war was about to break out, but as a deterrent to the Germans.
When I first went there, the factory itself was 3 parts empty, and there were very few people working there. Lots of jigs and fixtures and a few fuselages and wings. And we thought at the time, the chaps I was working with, that it was all a bit of a joke to be building planes, and we thought, whatever for? Because at that time we didn't think that there was going to be a war.
But British aircraft designers had taken the prospect of war more seriously. The result was the monoplane, the forerunner of the aircraft that won the Battle of Britain.
Now, the first of the modern generation to come forward in the great expansion of the Royal Air Force was Sidney Camp's Hawker Hurricane, and you see one here. The Hurricane was the first of the new generation of airplanes to exceed 300 miles an hour. Tremendous speed in those days. 300 miles an hour made it as fast as any competitive airplane anywhere in the world. And what's more, it had 8 machine guns, which were deadly, and a great new advance in armament, together with this advance in performance. And thanks to the Hawker method of construction, an easy airplane to build.
The Cinderella of the services was still the Army. The Chiefs of Staff had pleaded for an expeditionary force able to fight across the Channel, but the government insisted that public opinion would never stand for a continental war.
We used to discuss the question in the office as to at what point do the Chiefs of Staff resign. And we came to the conclusion that you didn't resign just because you disagreed with government policy. If the government had the policy they weren't going to send an army to the continent, well, you had to accept that. They weren't going to send it. But if they went the other way and said you weren't going to send an army, but you can't have any more tanks, then you say, well, in that case, we weren't responsible.
The Army was in no position to fight a modern war.
Finally, the battery is charged by tanks, bogus tanks in this case, and just as well, since the 18-pounders fire at them point blank. A direct hit, and he swerves to the right, his steering gear out of order.
It was quite an experience to be with the 1st Division, which should have been the spearhead of the force, which should have stopped the German invasion of the Rhineland. And we had the same machine guns as we finished the 1914-18 war with, the Lewis gun. We had flags for men. I had, in my platoon, which should have been about 45 to 50, I had 3 or 4 men. But we were essentially a cadre for reinforcing the Indian Army and our forces in India, and not a cadre for an expeditionary force in France. We relied on the French to do that.
The public at large was blissfully unaware of the Army's weakness. On parade for the coronation of King George VI, the soldiers of the Empire looked magnificent. And in these years of illusion, that was all most people expected of the Army.
The British Empire between the world wars was really a facade, that it made us feel strong. There was all that pink on the map, all those dominions and colonies, but it was really a sentimental association so far as the white dominions were concerned. We had no common foreign policy, we had no common defense policy, there was no operational plans for the fleets and the armies, and so really the empire existed only as a facade, and the sort of thing that we really saw most at things like jubilees and coronations on parade.
Chiefs of Staff were only too aware of the state of Britain's defences. They now endorsed appeasement. Warning of the danger of a war in the Far East, the Mediterranean and Europe simultaneously, they wrote, "We cannot exaggerate the importance of political action to reduce the numbers of our potential enemies." In 1937, the easygoing Mr. Baldwin stepped down as Prime Minister, and the ablest of his colleagues took over. Neville Chamberlain combined great drive with unshakable faith in his own judgment.
It didn't take long after Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister for him to make it absolutely clear that he was indeed determined to be his own master in foreign affairs. And this was a big change from Baldwin, because Baldwin was absolutely bored to tears by foreign affairs and never took much action in connection with them. But Chamberlain proved very quickly that he felt very differently. and that he was going to be the master.
He passionately believed that the combination of rearmament at a certain pace and getting onto better terms with the dictators was the best formula for peace. That was the root of Chamberlain's foreign policy. And at the same time, he agreed with his Chancellor of the Exchequer that over-rearming too fast could do great damage to the economy, which he'd nursed back to health. Now, it was within that framework, really, that every decision was made, and what Churchill has called false measurements, if you like, were taken.
For 4 years, Churchill had argued that the government was underestimating the pace and extent of Hitler's military preparations, and that Britain had fallen far behind. But his was a lonely voice.
Churchill did his utmost in Parliament, but he had a very small following, and he was a curious politician in that he had held every state department you could think of, and yet had not become Prime Minister because he antagonized so many people whom he attacked where they were opposing him. I mean, when he was the Treasury, he would hit the Admiralty over the head very hard. When he was the Admiralty, he'd hit the Treasury over the head. They'd all been attacked one way or another, so they didn't like him much. And Chamberlain didn't want him in the government because he didn't want somebody pressing all the time for more arms. He wanted somebody who would quietly keep that going and keep the Treasury happy about the amount of money being spent.
At number 10 Downing Street, Neville Chamberlain was very much his own man. He had little regard for the experts over the road at the Foreign Office, who favoured taking a firmer line with the dictators. Early in 1938, Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary, resigned, predicting that with the collusion of Mussolini, Hitler would soon take over Austria.
Germany moves into Austria, and these pictures will perhaps stir emotions in some of you which you may find it hard to repress. But sit through them calmly. They will teach us something, they will illustrate the seriousness of the times in which we live, and they will reinforce our determination to meet the difficulties of our world with courage.
Britain did not interfere, neither did France. Chamberlain told Parliament, the hard fact is that nothing could have arrested what has happened unless this country and others were prepared to use force. He was determined that Germany's action would not deflect him from his policy of appeasement. Hitler had sworn to redress the injustices of the Treaty of Versailles. With his annexation of Austria, he was well positioned to tackle his next objective, Czechoslovakia, now threatened by German divisions from the south as well as the north and the west. The peace treaties had left a large and restive German-speaking minority inside Czechoslovakia. These Sudeten Germans now became the pretext for the war Hitler wanted to launch. In Downing Street, Chamberlain was determined to stop him. Late at night on the 28th of August, he decided to frustrate Hitler by persuading the Czechs to surrender the Sudetenland. He, Chamberlain, and not his Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, would play the principal role. Appeasement was his policy, and he would put it to the test. He wrote about his mission to his sister.
Is it not positively horrible to think that the fate of hundreds of millions depends on one man, and he is half mad? I keep racking my brains to try and devise some means of averting a catastrophe. I thought of one so unconventional and daring that it rather took Halifax's breath away.
The hour of need has found the man, Mr. Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister. Since he took office, Mr. Chamberlain has never wavered in his determination to establish peace in Europe. At the hour when the dark clouds of war hung most menacingly above the world of men, the Prime Minister took a wise and bold decision. Well may we call him Chamberlain the Peacemaker.
It's almost impossible to describe to people brought up in the jet age what the news that Mr. Chamberlain was flying to Berchtesgaden meant to the British people and indeed to Europe and the world. It was a very brave act, morally and physically. He was, after all, an old man. And there was a tremendous mixture of feeling in the country. First of all, admiration.
3 cheers for Chamberlain.
Stunned surprise, absolutely electrifying shock, and perhaps most most important of all, the feeling that all hope was not lost, that we were still in with a chance.
Before he set off for his first meeting with Hitler, Chamberlain had told the cabinet that as a result of their failure to rearm, Britain and France were not in a position to fight Germany.
They walked up the steps for the frank and friendly talk, two men carrying between them the fate of 20 million.
The Chamberlain couldn't negotiate from a position of strength because the strength was not there. So he went into the meetings with Hitler in a weak position and hoped, first of all, that he could buy time, but secondly, that he might convince Hitler that there was no conceivable gain to be got from war. I think those were his priorities.
High up in Hitler's Alpine retreat, looking out over the Austrian Alps, Chamberlain told Hitler that if it could be done without force, he would not object to the detachment of the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Hitler gave Chamberlain a reluctant promise not to give the order to march. At their second meeting 1 week later, Chamberlain found that the stakes had been raised. Hitler announced that German troops would occupy the disputed territory in 10 days' time. Chamberlain was profoundly shocked, but he agreed to put the proposal to the Czechs. He returned to a Britain preparing for war, for the air raids all believed would come within days. The slit trenches in the parks testified to Britain's unreadiness.
Well, I was writing stories about air raid precautions and civil defense every day, but there were one or two pieces that went under my own name. There was one, for example, where I put the question, how strong are the country's passive defenses now? There is only one honest answer. If peace could be guaranteed until the end of 1939, we could afford to view the rate of progress with equanimity. But for any emergency which might arise, say, before the end of this year, the whole of the civilian population, and London in particular, is still highly vulnerable.
To judge from Hitler's behavior in Berlin, the emergency would come at the end of the month. But Hitler did acknowledge Chamberlain's efforts to defuse the crisis.
Ich bin Mr. Chamberlain dankbar für all die Bemühungen. Ich habe weiter versichert und ich wiederhole es hier, dass wenn dieses Problem gelöst ist, für Deutschland es kein territoriales Problem mehr in Europa gibt.
Chamberlain was inclined to accept Hitler's ultimatum, but public opinion was turning against further appeasement, and the cabinet decided that Hitler's demands were unacceptable. But on September the 28th, the news reached London that Hitler had agreed to another conference. The Prime Minister was the hero of Europe.
From the north, the south, and the west, 4 strong men converge on the German town of Munich to make it for one proud day the new center of the world. Mr. Chamberlain.
The Munich conference was an anticlimax. Britain and France had already conceded the Nazi leader's claim. Hitler was sullen. He'd been cheated of his war. That damned Chamberlain, he was heard to say, has spoiled my parade into Prague. Next morning, Chamberlain invited Hitler to sign a paper committing them both to the peaceful settlement of further disputes. Hitler was unenthusiastic. He hardly bothered to read the paper before he signed it. But to Chamberlain, the paper was a triumph, the prelude to a general settlement in Europe and even to peace for our time. He came home to scenes of wild relief.
So our Prime Minister has come back from his third and greatest journey, and he said
that the settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
The British rejoiced, but Chamberlain's private view of Hitler was ambivalent, as he told Lord Hume on their way back from the Munich conference.
I don't know if he ever worked out Hitler's state of mind properly. I think he told me, I remember coming back from the aeroplane in Munich, he thought Hitler was the nastiest bit of work he'd ever had to deal with. But you had to deal with people like that in international diplomacy. And therefore there was no escape negotiating with him. Is there a contradiction there? Did he really feel that he was mad and yet negotiated with him as a normal human being? I think he felt that you had to negotiate with him, even though he described him as mad. He was the leader of Germany, and he was the only fellow who could say yes to peace or war.
A minority was appalled. By bowing to Hitler's threat of force, Chamberlain had paid too high a price for temporary peace.
I can't describe to you our feelings about Chamberlain adequately. I find it very difficult to find words. He was regarded, I think, universally by working class people, and particularly by those who were labor inclined, as the arch enemy. And Munich for us was the climax. We felt that he betrayed the country, that he'd made war more inevitable, not less inevitable. They had a very powerful army, the Czech army, and they could have put up a good deal of resistance to Hitler, especially at that time, who wasn't fully armed and ready for war. But that had all been denied them by this agreement. We'd bought time, perhaps, but they'd lost time.
Con O'Neill was a junior diplomat at the British Embassy in Berlin.
When the Munich meeting was finally over, I was so depressed that I sent in my resignation immediately within the next day or two. I was glad then for many years that I had taken that resigning action, but now I have to confess that I think I was wrong. I think probably we made certainly as good, possibly even better use of the year's interval in rearming, above all in beginning to get our fighter aircraft into squadron service.
The pace of Allied rearmament, especially of British air power, now overtook that of Germany, but its cost was a bigger worry than ever.
The problem with rearmament from the British point of view was that we really had no longer got the financial resources or indeed the economic base to carry it on the scale that our defences and the imperial defences needed. And that was the absolute heart of the dilemma as to how much you did and how quickly you did it. And so you find by the beginning of 1939, the Chancellor of the Exchequer warning the Cabinet that if even peacetime rearmament went on at the current rate, Britain would be bankrupt within about a year or 2 years.
Once again, the rattle of a German army on the march echoes in Europe. Where that march may end, no man can foretell, least of all the man who gave the order. But here before our eyes unfolds the drama of a nation dying.
It was only 5 months since Munich. Hitler's pledges were worthless. Support for appeasement was dead. What replaced it was an almost reckless determination to resist Hitler's next demand. Even Chamberlain changed his tone, sounding a Churchillian note of defiance.
That was the German invasion of Czechoslovakia. Ask yourself now the question asked by the British Prime Minister.
Is this the last attack upon a small state? Or is it to be followed by others? Is this in fact a step in the direction of an attempt to dominate the world by force?
2 weeks later, Hitler made his next move clear by denouncing his non-aggression pact with Poland. Britain responded promptly with a formal guarantee of Poland's independence.
Giving our guarantee to Poland from a military point of view was a totally crazy thing to do. I don't know whether the Poles thought it totally crazy. I'm afraid I did even at the time, because there was no reason to suppose that we could help the Poles effectively, and of course we didn't. But we had to this extent compelled ourselves to be courageous by giving that guarantee to Poland.
An Anglo-French mission now arrived in Moscow in a belated and half-hearted attempt to negotiate a military alliance with Russia. It was intended to put muscle behind the guarantee to Poland and to reduce the military odds in Germany's favor. But it was the Germans who surprised the world by striking a deal with Stalin.
Von Ribbentrop, leaving Berlin for Moscow, ushers in a new, incomprehensible chapter in German diplomacy. Where is the anti-Comintern Pact? What has happened to the principles of Mein Kampf? Equally, what can Russia have in common with Germany to throw over the peace front, if she had? Newspapers were quick to fasten on the amazing turnaround in Hitler's policy, and one or two found a humorous angle to it.
Neville Chamberlain's last diplomatic move had come too late. All he could now do was prepare his country for certain war. Limited conscription had been introduced. Volunteers rushed to join up as their fathers had done 25 years before. The army formed the expeditionary force the government had resisted for so long. On September the 3rd, 2 days after Hitler invaded Poland, Neville Chamberlain broadcast to the nation.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. You can imagine what a bitter blow it is to me that all my long struggle to win peace has failed.
What happened to Britain in the 20 years before the outbreak of the war and our finally getting into war at that time, a war which we could not afford to wage and which we were bound to come out of ruined even if we won it. The basic reasons for that were in the illusions of a generation on the one hand. You can't just single out guilty men like, as people have done, like Chamberlain or Baldwin. This was a generation, they were partaking of the common beliefs and hopes and illusions of the whole broad spread of public opinion. So if anybody's going to be guilty, it is the illusions of the British people as a whole.
United and in a mood of quite unjustified optimism, the British army set off for France. It would be a full 6 months before the illusion of British invincibility was to be shattered by the threat of defeat.
An empire has sprung to arms. Its gallant manhood marches through the roads of France, singing a new song in the old spirit.
We'll continue this series next Sunday at 8:30. On Tuesday night, Soldiers shows that effective soldiers are made, not born, as we see the raw recruit reshaped into a fighter ready to cope with the stresses of war. Tuesday night. Next on ABC, Franco Nero stars as Garibaldi, the general.
This week on Four Corners, Indochina's Golden Triangle, where this year's opium crop is being harvested. It'll soon reach the streets of the West as 200 tons of pure heroin, enough to create a whole new generation of addicts. South, Burma's most powerful opium warlord, controls the lethal harvest.
And I can control 80% of the heroin.
A one-hour ABC special live from Canberra on Tuesday. At 7:30, the Treasurer, Paul Keating, will deliver the new budget live from Parliament House. We're expecting a surplus of $5 billion. Some say it'll be a record $10 billion. Find out what's in it for you and what you're in for. Jim Middleton will present a summary of the budget, followed by Paul Lynham, Paul Keating and the Shadow Treasurer, Dr. John Hewson, in a no-holds-barred debate. Budget 89. Their decision, your dollar. 7:30 Tuesday, ABC.
Good evening, Angela Pearman with the mid-evening national news. A mid-air collision between two balloons is being blamed for the air tragedy near Alice Springs today. 13 people were killed when their balloon deflated and plunged to the earth. The craft was one of 4 carrying tourists on scenic flights over the centre. The crash is reported to be the worst air disaster in Australia for more than 20 years. It's not unusual on any morning in Alice Springs to see up to 6 balloons in the sky. But this morning, something went wrong. This balloon took off on one of its regular tourist flight runs, but met tragedy minutes later. Just after 7 o'clock, the police received a distress call from the airport control tower saying that a balloon had gone down. An hour later, they found it. All 12 passengers and the pilot died as their craft crashed to the ground, reportedly after colliding with another balloon. In yet another balloon, a pilot from a company not involved in the collision, Ken Watts of Aussie Balloons, saw what happened afterwards.
All I saw was, when I looked up, was the balloon starting to deflate itself, which it continued to do until such times as the balloon was completely deflated and plummeting to the earth.
Air safety investigators have flown from Darwin and Adelaide to find out exactly what went wrong to cause the deaths of 13 people. We regret the suggestion in an earlier news report tonight that the name of the pilot killed in the balloon crash was Michael Samby. The police have not yet released any names of the dead, but Michael Samby was not aboard the balloon that came down and is not one of the victims. The pilot strike will hit hard tomorrow as Sydney Airport is affected by industrial action. Extra flights are operating tonight to move passengers from the city before Ansett and Australian Airlines pilots begin a 12-hour stoppage. And tomorrow will decide whether there's worse to come. The president of the African National Congress, Oliver Tambo, is reported to have suffered a heart attack. 71-year-old Tambo, leader of the black struggle against apartheid for more than 20 years, has been flown from Zambia to Britain for treatment. Brazilian police, 4 armed kidnappers and their 3 hostages are spending another night on a highway southwest of Rio de Janeiro. Authorities have been trying to meet the kidnappers' demands to fly them to Paraguay, but had trouble finding a willing pilot. When they did get a volunteer, it was too close to nightfall for landing near the highway, where the hostages are being held in an armoured car surrounded by police. The kidnappers have more than $55,000 ransom they were given for freeing a 9-year-old boy yesterday. Now the weather outlook for the capital cities tomorrow. Fine everywhere except for Perth, which could get a shower or two. And though dry, it's likely to be cloudy in Sydney and Adelaide. And that's the news to this minute. Next, the road to war.
In the beginning, there was the first contact, and the Highlanders believed that the new arrivals with white skin must have been gods. Since then, the gods have departed, leaving behind Joe Lay, half Highlander, half white. Joe Lay's neighbours are a race at odds with Western culture, and confused by the coffee plantation owner, who possesses a knowledge of the old ways that are fixed within the minds of the people, as well as a firm grasp of the West. A film by award-winning Australian producers Bob Connolly and Robert Anderson, who spent 18 months in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, to deliver to the screen one of the greatest accounts ever of a culture in distress in Joe Lay's Neighbours, our Wednesday night special, 8:30 on ABC.
Good evening and welcome to our Sunday feature. Tonight, Hitler totally underestimates his opponents in The Road to War.
More than any other man or any combination of events, Adolf Hitler was the cause of the Second World War. War, for its own sake, was his driving obsession. Prolonged peace, he once said, would make a nation rot. Hitler never made a secret of his aims. He committed them to print and repeated them in countless speeches. He triumphed because the world was blind to the signals he constantly raised. Time and again, Hitler could have been stopped, by his fellow Germans at first, by foreign leaders later. Not until 1939 did the Allied leaders move to check him, and by then it was too late to block his road to war. The First World War ended in 1918 with Germany's surrender in response to an offer of an honorable peace by the victors, Britain, France, and America. Early next year, the victorious powers met at Versailles to draw up the terms of the treaties. Driven by public opinion in their own countries, the Allied leaders were in a vindictive mood when they assembled in the Hall of Mirrors. They held Germany responsible for the war. They demanded safety and retribution. They stripped Germany of her colonial empire, reduced her armed forces to a mere 100,000, distributed pieces of her territory to her neighbors, and ordered Germany to pay huge sums in reparations, compensation for the damage done by German aggression. The German delegates had expected to be allowed to negotiate. Instead, they were summoned and given a week to accept or suffer invasion and occupation. They signed, but Germans of every political persuasion were bitter. Versailles created a resentment that was to shape German politics for 20 years.
We felt in the German people that this treaty was dictated by hate of the other side, by a tremendous hate, especially by the French, but partly, I'm sure, by British people too, and by the American people too. You feel so helpless when the victors trample on a loser who's already very weak on the ground, you see. And that, this feeling was one of the reasons that later on, much later on, the people looked at Hitler because he brought another possibility for the future in their mind.
10 years later, in 1929, It was a campaign against further payment of reparations that brought the ex-corporal Adolf Hitler from local obscurity to nationwide prominence. Reparations was already a national obsession, and Hitler easily persuaded his crowds that they were being ruined by the peace treaties as a whole.
It was fixed we should pay until 1983. 1983. And this was incredible. Huh? And so the first idea, of course, was that all these payments should be stopped by Germany. Definitely stopped. Not paying any more.
The idea that Allied injustice was the principal cause of German misery was a myth. But poverty was real enough, and in 1923, hyperinflation wiped out the savings of millions of middle-class Germans. 6 years later, the Great Depression struck Germany, and confidence in parliamentary democracy largely collapsed. That was Hitler's chance.
I can say Germany was very bad years till Hitler came in 1933. Everybody was poor. There were, I think, about 7 million unemployed people. It was no hope. And Hitler, I must say that he was the first man who, with his speeches and his ideas, he gave hope to the people.
Hitler promised bread and jobs, but what captured his audiences was his aggressive self-confidence, his conviction that he could bring about national revival by overthrowing the existing order of things.
Wir sind intolerant. Ich habe mir ein Ziel gesteckt, nämlich die 30 Parteien aus Deutschland hinauszufegen.
It was not only the Nazis who promised to overthrow parliamentary government. The Communist Party had made big gains in the cities, especially in Berlin, and the bourgeoisie was terrified of revolution.
My feeling was we are just on our way to become a communist state, you see. And that was, in my opinion, the reason to take again a gun in the hand and to fight it. Because we had the feeling, young as we were, the elder ones have enough of the war and they don't want to fight. They take everything, accepted everything. And we youngers, we wanted to fight.
In Germany in the early 1930s, there was civil war on the streets. Nazis fought communists in all the big towns. As the democratic parties lost ground, the future became a choice between extremes, the far left and the far right.
We young people saw the choice before us as communism or National Socialism.
Kaputt sind wir auf jeden Fall, wenn es so weitergeht oder wenn der Kommunismus kommt.
It was now make or break for Germany.
Kein Unterschied.
We've had it if the communists win. So there was only one answer. National Socialism. We must give it a chance.
Die Chance geben.
Curiously, it was a series of general elections that brought the Nazis within reach of government. No more than a splinter group in the Reichstag in 1928, they became in 1932 the biggest single party, with a third of the popular vote. That was their peak. What they lacked was an overall majority, and later that year they lost 2 million votes. What saved Hitler from probable oblivion was a deal with the conservatives. Each side despised the other, each expected to come out on top. The conservatives got nearly all the cabinet posts, but Hitler was chancellor, and he made sure that his right-hand man, Hermann Göring, was in charge of the police.
These conservatives thought Hitler couldn't last, and he was not the man to be feared or anything. But they had been of the governing class, ruling class, for a longer time, and they knew how to govern, and they had all the connections, and they were real Germans. So they thought, if we get into coalition with this Nazi party, with this Hitler man, after 6 months or so, he will drop out, and we will stay in power.
It soon became clear that the conservatives had underestimated Hitler. Someone set fire to the Reichstag. Hitler pronounced it a communist plot. He suspended all constitutional rights, arrested 5,000 communists and socialists, and declared what became a permanent state of emergency. The dictatorship was in place.
Der Kampf gegen den Marxismus wurde damals zum ersten Mal zu einem Kampfziel erhoben. Damals gelobte ich mir zum ersten Mal, als unbekannter Eiserner diesen Krieg zu beginnen und nicht zu ruhen, bis endlich diese Erscheinung aus dem deutschen Leben beseitigt sein würde.
What followed was summed up in the word Gleichschaltung, forcible coordination. It required systematic and public acts of brutality, like the burning of books.
In Berlin, wie in anderen Universitätsstädten Deutschlands, wurden undeutsche und unsittliche Bücher von den Studenten eingesammelt und öffentlich verbrannt.
Nazi stormtroopers now enjoyed the protection of the state, and one of their favorite excesses, the persecution of Jews, was institutionalized. The Jews were driven out of business and the professions, and driven out of Germany. Those that stayed ended up in concentration camps. The first camp opened in March 1933. It was built at a place called Dachau. Labor liberates, said the slogan on the gate. Josef Felder was a socialist who voted against Hitler in the last free vote in the Reichstag. He was one of thousands of men and women whose names had been marked down during the Nazis' struggle for power. His fellow inmates were writers, mayors, Jews, trade unionists, social democrats, and communists. Felder was kept in chains in the punishment block. He was fed every 4th day. He remembers that one of those feeding days happened to be Christmas Eve.
Im Laufe des 24. Dezember, ich konnte...
On December the 24th, on Christmas Eve, the guards came to my cell door, which I could reach even though my legs were in irons,
Weißwürste, bayerische Weißwürste und Kartoffelsalat und...
and they showed me a plate of Bavarian sausages with potato salad, and said, "This would be a nice gallows meal for you, but you don't deserve it, you traitor."
Du Hetzer. Später kam der Schafführer Unterhuber.
And then the chief guard came carrying a rope and showed me how I could hang myself from the overhead pipes. "We'll give you an hour," he said. "Then we'll come and do it ourselves."
Dann machen wir's.
They came back twice during the night. It was psychological pressure to try and make me commit suicide.
Der mich zum Selbstmord treiben sollte. Das war's.
Hitler now put the country to work, chiefly on public projects like roads. He formed a compulsory labor corps. Unemployment fell dramatically.
Die 6 Jahre vergangen soll ein Riesenwerk zeigen von unserem Ding
Hitler soon energized a nation that longed for decisive leadership. He showed an uncanny understanding of the attraction to the masses of a combination of force and success. His personal appeal was greatest among women and boys. Günter Roos, then aged 12, remembers seeing the Führer in the flesh.
Ich war so ergriffen, dass ich...
I was so moved, I was speechless. I couldn't shout Heil. I just stood there and looked.
Und dann passierte...
And then the most incredible thing happened to me.
Hitler sah mir tief in die Augen.
Hitler looked deep into my eyes.
Und dieser Moment...
I can't describe this moment with words.
...sich nicht mit Worten schildern. Danach, als vorbei war...
Afterwards, I stood there for half a minute or so, hypnotized.
Gestanden. Und dann ging ich zu meinem...
Then I turned to my friends and said, he looked deep into my eyes.
Tief in die Augen gesehen. Und das Faszinierende war...
The fascinating thing is that they said, no, he looked into my eyes.
Jeder hat den Eindruck, hat
sich... It was a mass hypnosis.
...hineinversenkt. Es war eine Massenhypnose.
Günter Roos described his great day in his diary, and later that night the family spoke of their glimpse of the leader as a profound religious experience.
Einer sagte, so ungefähr muss es vor 2000 Jahren gewesen sein.
One of us said, it must have been like this 2,000 years ago when Jesus said to his disciples, leave your home and family and follow me. This was precisely the feeling I had.
Hatte ich damals auch.
Hitler, now commander-in-chief, demanded an oath of loyalty sworn by every soldier. In 1935, he revealed the existence of a German air force and announced that conscription would bring the army to 5 times the limits permitted by Versailles. To justify his actions, he argued that universal disarmament, foreseen by the peace treaty, had never taken place.
It was said by the Allies of the First World War, I mean, that Germany must disarm first, and then they would follow with a disarmament. This was said obviously and clearly by the Allies. But years and years passed away, and nothing happened concerning the disarmament of the Allied side. On the contrary, the Czechs, the Poles, armed, aided by the French, and encircling Germany. And so what was left? Germany was in the middle, you see. So because the others had broken the promise for disarmament, obviously they had broken this promise. They hadn't disarmed, no? So Germany was forced to rearm. Very simple.
Britain and France protested against Germany's rearmament. That was all they did. A few weeks later, Britain, without consulting the French, concluded a naval agreement with Germany. It recognized Germany's right to build a powerful modern navy, from battleships to U-boats. Hitler hoped his agreement with the British would prove to be a breakthrough. He wanted a settlement with a passive Britain that would allow him to pursue his long-term plan of expansion to the east. Herbert Friedrichs was now a member of the German naval staff.
He loved England. That was a funny thing, see. He loved everything which was might. And he loved England because it was, for, in his opinion, the expression of the building an empire, as Hitler perhaps wanted to. He wanted to crush the Russians. he hoped the British would do nothing against it. And I think that during those years when Hitler said, I hate the Russians and that's the greatest danger for Europe, England must always be a friend of us, or become a friend of us. That's what he meant.
Hitler now embarked on a gamble that was to overturn the entire post-war system of security. Under the peace treaties, the Rhineland had become a demilitarized zone. At the insistence of France, determined to block a German invasion, German troops were forbidden to set foot in it. On a Saturday morning in March 1936, a German battalion entered Cologne and occupied both banks of the Rhine. The whole zone had been out of bounds to German soldiers since the war. Wilhelm Meger, then aged 18, was on his way to his sister's wedding when he spotted German troops on the bridge.
Um 12 Uhr traten die Soldaten zusammen.
At midday, the battalion fell in and marched across the bridge onto the left bank. I was carried away by the military music. Full of enthusiasm, I followed the battalion, pushing my bike.
Unknown to anybody else, the troops had orders to retreat if France's vastly greater forces moved. Neither France nor Britain interfered, prompting Hitler to remark, "The world belongs to the man with guts."
When I got to the left bank, I suddenly remembered the wedding. I'd missed the lunch, but I got there just in time for coffee. "Why are you so late?" And I said, "I've got news. Our troops have occupied Cologne." Great excitement and pleasure, especially from the younger people there. We all drank an enthusiastic toast. In fact, we drank several.
5 months after the occupation of the Rhineland, Germany staged the Olympic Games in Berlin. Hitler's successful defiance of Britain and France had strengthened his prestige at home. And his own self-confidence must have been boosted when the athletes from France, the country he had just humiliated, gave him the Hitler salute. The Games were a public relations triumph. Droves of white doves projected an image of Germany at peace with itself and at peace with the world. In 1937, Hitler explained to his generals the grand design he had outlined years before in his book Mein Kampf. He told them his defiance of the Treaty of Versailles was merely the overture. His real objective was the creation by conquest of an empire in the eastern part of Europe in which the German master race would subject the present inhabitants, Poles, Russians, Slavs and Jews, to slavery. His vision is said to have appalled some of his generals, but no empire, said Hitler, had ever been built without force.
Hitler followed a so-called plan in stages. What he had in mind was to become the dominant power in Central Europe, then to get the hegemony over the European continent, then in a next stage to conquer living space in the Soviet Union, and in a fourth stage he had in mind to, well, to fight against the United States and to conquer a maritime empire as well.
Hitler's first chance to expand into Central Europe presented itself in Austria, where fervent local Nazis were exploiting ancient ties of language and culture and agitating for Anschluss, or union with the fatherland. This was expressly forbidden by the treaties, lest Germany become too strong. In an effort to hold back the tide, Austrian Chancellor Schuschnigg had asked Britain to guarantee his country's independence. When Britain declined, he proposed a plebiscite, or referendum.
Dass unser Österreich Österreich bleiben muss.
Hitler ordered his generals to prepare to march on Vienna, but he had one nagging doubt. Would Britain intervene? The German Foreign Minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, was visiting London. To him, the Führer sent an emissary. A young Austrian Nazi, Reinhard Spitzy, was summoned to the Chancellery.
I stood alone in front of the big Führer. And Hitler immediately said, I need now a messenger for Ribbentrop because I must know what the British would do if I enter in Austria. What is necessary because there is already a certain disorder. And Schuschnigg, and then he got furious and said, Schuschnigg tried to cheat me with a faked election and plebiscite, and I'm not going to admit that. I must know what the British would do.
Spitzy returned from London with Ribbentrop's assurance in writing that Britain would not interfere. He reported to the leader.
I entered into the room and greeted him in a normal way. Then we said, sit down. I'm going to read that. Oh, that's fine. Good. So we can trust the British will do nothing. He said, well, the whole embassy has the same opinion. Nothing will happen. That's good. And then he told me, so tomorrow we are going to Austria.
Spitzy's reward was a place in the motorcade as the Führer returned to the land of his birth.
Hitler was full of emotion, and sometimes he nearly had tears in his eyes. It was, without any doubt, the greatest moment in his life.
Enormous crowds welcomed Hitler to the Heldenplatz, the main square in Vienna. The peace treaties had reduced Austria's importance in the world, and most of its citizens longed to be part of Germany's national revival. Ingeborg Swinny, then aged 20, was one of thousands transfixed by the Führer.
Ich weiß, die alte Ostmark des Deutschen Reiches.
When he came in, you could see people were in tears, and some even fainted. And I personally, I think all the others too, saw in Hitler our savior, almost like that, because we in Austria had such a bad life, very sad life. It was high unemployment, and many people had nothing to eat. So it was really like in the last minute that Hitler came in, brought to people food and work.
Als Führer und Kanzler der deutschen Nation und des Reichs melde ich vor der deutschen Geschichte nunmehr den Eintritt meiner Heimat in das Deutsche Reich. Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil!
One of these reasons why we supported Hitler was all about the Jews, how they behaved, how they lived amongst us. And very, very many lived in Vienna at this time. First of all, it was their behavior and their appearance. They looked so dirty and with their long hairs and rather strange amongst us. You know, they didn't really belong to Vienna in a way.
But they had the power. All the banks and all the shops, everything was in Jewish hands.
As they had done in Germany, the Nazis were able to build on the ingrained anti-Semitism of so many Austrians. The treatment of Jews in Vienna was savage.
Within a day or two, Jews were rounded up in the streets. Elderly Jews, including my father, were forced to scrub the streets on their knees to wash off the slogans from the Schuschnigg plebiscite. When it happened, I happened to see it. My father was there on his knees, surrounded by a group of 30 or 40 people in brown shirts, and also passers-by who yelled and clapped and shouted, "Jewish pig." And it went on for about 20 to 25 minutes, and he was pushed away. And of course, thousands more were doing the same, forced to do the same things in Vienna over the next 2 or 3 days. You see, it went on and on.
Later, Edward Ari's father died of starvation in a concentration camp. The annexation of Austria opened the door to the next objective, Czechoslovakia, where the Versailles Treaty had left 3.5 million Germans on the Czech side of the border. Encouraged by the example of the Austrians, Sudeten Germans, as they were called, agitated to join the Reich. And for Hitler, their grievances provided the pretext for a short, sharp war of conquest. He ordered his generals to prepare a lightning strike. Nazi propagandists busily spooked up the crisis. German newsreels showed persecuted Sudeten Germans fleeing to the fatherland.
Lüge, Verrat und Wortbruch der Tschechen beschwören die Gefahr eines allgemeinen Krieges herauf.
What the world was to call the Munich crisis brought Europe to the brink of war, and Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain to Hitler's home at Berchtesgaden. Hitler wanted armed conflict. The Czechs wanted to fight with British and French support. Chamberlain was determined to arrange concessions and save the peace. At the height of the negotiations, Hitler was struck by doubts about the martial spirit of his people.
Hitler had the glorious idea to let a brigade of tanks, a whole division of tanks, pass through the center of Berlin, and he would have wished enthusiasm of the Berlinese people and shouting and content, but nobody was in the street. Everybody went home. Poor old women looked a bit, then they went away. It was a complete disaster for Hitler. And Hitler looked at it and said, with this people I can't lead a war.
The fear of a general war was shared by sections of the aristocracy and the upper classes, notably by men in key positions in the army and the foreign service. They believed that Hitler could be overthrown if his demands met with greater resistance in Britain and France. Hans von Herbert, then an attaché in Moscow, was one of a group that planned to arrest the Chancellor as soon as he gave the final order to invade Czechoslovakia.
I consider it as my duty as a good German to try everything to prevent Hitler to start a Second World War. The idea was to convince the British and the French not to give in to Hitler. But unfortunately, all what we told the British in London and in Moscow, and also what we told the French, did not induce the French and the English to take a firm stand. Finally, in Munich, they gave in.
The conspiracy collapsed when Chamberlain and the French showed once again they were not prepared to stand up to Hitler. Instead, they compelled Czechoslovakia to hand over the Sudeten area without a fight. Hitler's gains included the elaborate Czech frontier defenses, large supplies of coal, and 3.5 million new Germans. But Hitler was ungrateful, as Reinhard Spitzi, here revisiting the building where the Munich Agreement was signed, recalls.
Hitler didn't like this Munich conference because he had the feeling that he was cheated of his little war, smashing Czechoslovakia, and Hitler was very much annoyed by this sort of democratic conversation. He wasn't impressed by Chamberlain, and he had the feeling that Britain is gone to the dogs, that it's in the hand of capitalists, Jews, Democrats, liberals, and so on, and no more empire spirit. And he thought that Britain is not in the shape and has not the will to defend the empire in an energetic, decisive way.
What made headlines outside Germany was a piece of paper supposedly promising peace for our time. Both Chamberlain and Hitler had signed it, but according to Spitzi, only one of them took it seriously.
When Hitler and Ribbentrop stepped out from this building, I was following them, and I listened to their conversation. Ribbentrop complained about the ridiculous piece of paper that Hitler had signed together with Chamberlain. Hitler said, "Don't bother. This piece of paper has no importance at all." And then I heard, and I was convinced, that Hitler did not intend to keep the Munich Agreement.
In March 1939, Hitler tore it up. German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. This time, there was no welcome for the Germans. It was an act of pure, unprovoked aggression. Czechoslovakia was an independent foreign country shorn of its German-speaking districts 5 months before.
When he entered Prague, he said, within a few weeks, nobody will talk about it. Well, I don't say that he meant this. It was a way of talking. But he thought that the British would forget. He forgot that that was the turning point, this moment, when he enslaved other nations and didn't unite Germans. And from that very moment, he became an imperialist.
Hitler's unopposed conquest of Czechoslovakia altered the balance of power in Europe. The Czech army of 30 divisions was disbanded, its aircraft, tanks, and weapons used to re-equip the units of the Wehrmacht, as was Czechoslovakia's impressive armaments industry. Hitler's next target was Poland. Again, there was a ready-made pretext Hitler could use. Versailles had deprived Germany of the city of Danzig, and the Polish corridor, giving Poland access to the sea, had cut off East Prussia from the Reich. But those were secondary considerations. Poland was to be a launching pad for Hitler's historic confrontation with the Soviet Union.
Denn wenn Krieg mit der Sowjetunion wollte, Lebensraum im Osten gewinnen wollte,
to win Lebensraum, or living space in the East, Hitler needed a common frontier with the Soviet Union. He could get this if the Poles allowed the German army right of passage. But he could also get this, and this of course is what happened, if he conquered Poland. Then he would not only have a common frontier with the Soviet Union, but a base from which to launch his attack.
In Britain, Neville Chamberlain had experienced an abrupt awakening. Convinced that Hitler must be stopped, he offered a guarantee of Polish independence. Distance, however, made the guarantee worthless without a military alliance with the Soviet Union. So, in August, an Anglo-French delegation set off by sea to negotiate with the Russians. On the British side, at least, it was a half-hearted enterprise, but it jolted Hitler into action.
It came to a crisis when Hitler got the news that the French and the British were negotiating with the Soviets about a treaty, anti-German treaty. Then he got nervous. He thought these three powers against me is a little bit too much, and then he started to put pressure on the embassy in Moscow and also on the negotiations in Berlin, that you must come to a positive end.
Hitler now pulled off the greatest and most cynical diplomatic coup of his career. He sent his foreign minister to Moscow to do a deal with Stalin, whose country he planned later to destroy. Hans von Herbert was in the Ribbentrop team.
Neither the British nor French could believe that Hitler and Stalin, who were like fire and water, would come together. They didn't realize how dangerous the offers of Hitler were, because Hitler could offer to the Soviet Union all what they wanted. Practically, he offered to the Stalin all what the Soviet Union had lost after the First World War, the Baltic states and parts of Poland, and so it was a wonderful deal for Stalin.
It was also a wonderful deal for Hitler. With Stalin in the Nazi camp, Poland was isolated and effectively defenseless.
Mit Gewalt und Rechtsbetrug sollen zuerst einmal die Volksdeutschen aus dem polnischen Staatsgebiet verjagt werden. In ständig wachsender Zahl flüchten sie vor dem polnischen Terror in den Schutz des Reiches.
Nazi propaganda concocted the usual alibi. Newsreel pictures of German families driven from their homes in Poland provided the familiar pretext for a war of liberation.
In treuer Verbundenheit mit unseren Brüdern im Osten steht ganz Deutschland in Bereitschaft. Hier! Hier!
Hitler spent most of the summer at Berchtesgaden, his country home. His ambassador in London had warned him that Britain would fight over Poland. Hitler ignored him. His course was set on war. He told his generals that the Western leaders would back down. I saw them at Munich, he said. Our opponents are little worms.
The answer of Hitler was always the same. England will do everything bad against us what is possible. Break diplomatic relations and so on. But one thing England would not do, enter a war. And that he said, despite England had told the Polish government months ago, we stay at your side if you will be attacked.
As Hitler told the story, the Second World War began at Gliwice, a small town on the German-Polish border. To prove that Poland fired first and started the war, a unit of SS men mounted a sham attack on a German radio station. As evidence, they left behind them corpses in Polish uniforms, actually the inmates of concentration camps. So Hitler was able to claim at a speech to the Reichstag the next day that Polish aggression had caused the war.
Polen hat heute Nacht zum ersten Mal auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch mit bereits regulären Soldaten geschossen. Seit 5:45 Uhr wird es zurückgeschossen. Und von jetzt ab wird Bombe mit Bombe vergolten.
At dawn on the 1st of September, Hitler launched his blitzkrieg from prepared positions all along the border. It was to be a quick, easy, local war.
An einer Ausweitung des Krieges.
This was a local war to get back old German territories. Nobody thought England or France would get involved because we completely trusted in the genius of the Führer, who was always proclaiming his love of peace. We were also convinced that, as a veteran of the First World War, the Führer would never start a war on two fronts.
On September the 3rd at 9 a.m., Britain's ambassador in Berlin, Sir Neville Henderson, delivered his government's ultimatum to Germany. He was received by the chief interpreter, Paul Schmidt.
And he read the document to me. It was an ultimatum with the sentence that said, unless the German government declares its readiness to withdraw their troops to the German-Polish frontier, and unless they announce that readiness in 2 hours, there will be a state of war between His Majesty's government and the German government.
Adolf Hitler was in his study at the Reich Chancellery. Schmidt hurried over to report.
I walked straight into Hitler's study, where I found him with his foreign minister, Herr von Ribbentrop, and I translated this ultimatum to him. And when I came to the last sentence, there was a state of complete silence in that very important study, or the most important study which existed in Germany at that time. Now it had happened, and they were holding their breath because it was somewhat unexpected.
It was Hitler who broke the silence. Glaring at Foreign Minister Ribbentrop, he asked, "What now?" Ribbentrop's reply, "I assume that within the hour the French ultimatum will follow." Eyewitnesses have recorded that the German in the street was shocked at this extension of the conflict. He had become accustomed to Hitler's bloodless victories and prepared at worst for brief, relatively painless wars. But the indefatigable young diarist Günter Ross was loyal to the last.
Nachdem England uns ein Ultimatum stellte,
after England presented us with an ultimatum, England and France declared war on us at midday.
Diese Schweine.
The pigs.
Man sieht da das Entsetzen und dieses Unverständnis.
You see there our rage and bafflement that England and France should dare to interfere in purely German matters and try and prevent us from recreating the old German Reich.
Die uns daran hindern wollten, wieder das alte Deutsche Reich wiederherzustellen.
Auf seiner Fahrt an die Front vor Warschau begrüßt der Führer seine Leibstandarte, die sich bei den harten Kämpfen in Polen glänzend geschlagen hat.
The defeat of Poland gave Hitler his common frontier with Russia. He had made war. But it was not the war he wanted. His misjudgment of the temper of Britain and France had wrecked his plan. Before the great march of conquest in the East could begin, he must eliminate both France and Britain. Either that or plunge Germany into a prolonged two-front war.
Next week at 8:30 we'll continue our Sunday feature, The Road to War. A preview follows. And don't miss Soldiers, Tuesday night at 10:50, when we examine the role of the infantryman, fighting against all odds. Next on ABC, Garibaldi, the General.
The soldiers who returned to their families in 1918 believed that neither they nor their sons would ever be called on to fight for France again. They had fought the war to end wars. The Germans had been defeated. Their weapons were on display in the Place de la Concorde in Paris. The whole nation was determined never to be menaced by Germany again. But France was more deeply scarred by the war than anyone knew. For 4 years, the country had been the scene of the worst of the fighting. Now there was peace. But France would remain a battleground. Frenchmen pitted against Frenchmen for the next 20 years. In November 1918, France took back Strasbourg, the capital of the border province of Alsace-Lorraine. She had been forced to cede the region to Germany in 1871, following her defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. To the French, the liberation of Strasbourg was long overdue.
C'était la grande, grande joie. It was a time of great joy and enthusiasm. Everybody went out into the street. The tricolour flag was flying at every window. We wondered where everybody had come from so quickly. Everyone had a tricolour cockade. Women and children were still wearing Alsatian costumes, and everybody was shouting at the tops of their voices, "Vive la France!" They sang the Marseillaise. We were amazed that our neighbour knew it so well. We knew it, but were amazed that the neighbour did too. Everybody was singing it. The enthusiasm was indescribable.
No alteration of frontiers could compensate France for the suffering she had endured in the war. Nearly 1.5 million men had been killed. That was a quarter of the population under 30 in a country whose birth rate was static. 4 million had been wounded. Of those, 1.5 million were permanently maimed. Nearly every family had somebody to mourn. Among Marie Royer's close relations, 8 men were killed.
In my family, we lost the eldest of my brothers and 7 cousins. When my brother, Marcel Royer, died aged 26 on the 4th of September 1916, we felt we would never stop weeping. Later on, we could never even mention his name without tears in our eyes.
It has affected me. I still remember it. It's something that will only disappear when I die. It's unthinkable. When I remember the misery the soldiers suffered at the front, tears come to my eyes. What do you expect? It's like that. Like that.
Oui, la guerre.
Yes, the war, especially one like that one, scars you. It scars you for life. You feel as though you'll never get away from it. It feels like extermination.
Northeastern France was devastated. Towns like Saint-Quentin had to be rebuilt from scratch. Much of French industry had been concentrated here, and French leaders insisted that the Germans, who had caused the war and had no devastated regions to rebuild, must pay heavily. They demanded that Germany reimburse the Allies for the entire cost of the war and also pay pensions to the families of the dead and disabled. At the peace conference at Versailles in 1919, French leaders encountered resistance from their allies. France wanted Germany weakened permanently. America and Britain thought too harsh a peace would lead to further wars. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles was deeply significant for the French. It was here that triumphant Prussia had proclaimed the Second German Empire 50 years before. 5 times in 100 years, Paris had heard the crash of German guns. 3 times Parisians had watched the German army marching through their streets. The peace treaties were a compromise. Germany was ordered to pay reparations until the 1980s. She lost most of her armed forces, all her colonies, and pieces of her territory. But France's allies rejected her demand that Germany's western frontier run along the River Rhine. Instead, the Rhineland became a demilitarized buffer zone. It was the only province the Allies occupied. Germany was left far greater in population and industrial capacity than France could ever be. In the early 1920s, the French recovered their morale. Paris was a magnet, the most stimulating city in the world.
Needless to say, in those days, we weren't bored, we had a good laugh, we naturally played the music that was written and which suited that era so well. It was the time of the crazy years, affluence, rich people, freedom to do what you wanted and freedom to work. There was work for anyone who wanted it.
Et la liberté du travail. Ceux qui voulaient travailler n'en manquaient pas.
La France est assurément une grande puissance, même une très grande puissance.
France was a great power, a very great one, even at the European level. She had the first army in the world during the 1920s. She had quite an extraordinary financial power, rebuilt with investments abroad, in particular in Central European countries. She had an active economic growth. She modernized her economy, unlike Great Britain, who during the same period was going through a certain lethargy, or at least non-growth. Finally, France was playing a key role in the whole international political scene in Europe.
In 1923, French troops occupied the Ruhr, Germany's richest industrial region. For more than a year, the Germans had defaulted on their reparations payments, and under the peace treaty, France was entitled to retaliate. But Britain disapproved. She considered the reparations bill excessive and France unduly grasping. The German government ordered a general strike. In a clash at the Krupp works in Essen, French troops shot and killed 13 German workers. Eventually, the Germans agreed to pay. But France had been isolated internationally. This was the last time she would act without Britain in her dealings with the Germans.
This aggressive image is very important because it was to impress Europe for the next 20 years. Even Great Britain was impressed and tended to overestimate the French strength and underestimate the German strength.
When Clemenceau went to Oxford in 1920 to receive an honoris causa doctorate, he met Lloyd George and said to him, "So why this hostility towards us?" Lloyd George replied, "You know very well that English policy is always to support the others against the most powerful country on the continent. As it happens, you were the strongest country."
Britain and America had agreed at Versailles to guarantee France's frontier against German aggression. When the American Senate refused to ratify the treaty, British assent lapsed. It was a bitter blow to the French, who now sought other allies to help contain Germany. Leaving aside the Soviet Union, still in the throes of revolution, France created a network of alliances with smaller states: Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. But in the West, France adopted a strictly passive strategy. She invested billions in fortifying her border with Germany from Switzerland to Belgium. There the fortification stopped. It was called the Maginot Line. It was a brilliant feat of military engineering. It was impregnable, at least against a frontal attack. It saved manpower, in which the French could never hope to match the Germans. Above all, it would save French lives.
When you attack, you lose thousands of men. And, as you know, this war of 1914, in its first months, was extremely bloody. An entire French youth, all the young intellectuals, were mown down during those first months of war. By building the Maginot Line, the soldiers would be protected as far as possible. The essential lesson of this war, which became the essential French military doctrine, was that defense was the most important thing.
D'abord, se défendre.
The trouble was that the Maginot Line absorbed almost all the resources France was prepared to commit to her armed forces. Even worse, this chain of blockhouses and bunkers created a passive mentality, and ultimately an inertia from which the French army's commanders never escaped.
The Maginot Line represented an invisible force for France. They were always harping on at us that with this Maginot Line, France was strong, invincible, that it really was a wall, a barrier, that no one could invade us. And France really did feel very, very strong at that time. They told us at school and everywhere else, and even our parents used to tell us that with this Maginot Line, France would never again be invaded.
Invasion was a less immediate concern than the disappearance of prosperity. Year after year, successive short-lived governments had avoided unpopular measures like adequate taxation of the wealthy. No government ever lasted long enough to take command of the economy. And when the Depression hit France, the treasury was virtually empty, the effect of massive borrowing. Instead of spending its way out of the Depression, as happened in America, the government took the opposite course. It resorted to deflation. Production was curbed and wages cut. Even the pensions of widows and ex-servicemen were reduced. The economic crisis brought social divisions into sharp relief. Josephine Baker, the black American singer, continued to pack the nightclubs of Paris. For the famous and the fashionable, life hardly changed. That bred resentment.
My mother worked for some middle-class people. That's to say, very wealthy people, who could afford to have an all-purpose maid 24 hours out of 24. She lived in a windowless garret. She only had a horrible iron bed and chair. When she had a moment, she ate off a corner of the kitchen table, the leftovers from her employers. And even then, what Madame had picked out and chosen to leave her. My mother's life was exhausting, and she had very few pleasures. That was the case with a lot of workers.
Economic and political stagnation exacerbated conflicts that reached back into history. By tradition, the peasants hated the industrial workers, both groups despised the bourgeoisie, and everybody envied and detested the rich. The new element was political extremism. On the left, the Communist Party, on the right, a dozen assorted fascist movements. What united the two extremes was their hostility to parliamentary democracy, which seemed impotent.
We have to remember that during the first 10 years, between 1920 and 1930, there was a succession of more than 25 ministries.
In the Chamber of Deputies, the Parliament, no single party could hold on to a majority. No sooner did someone form a government than a section of his supporters would defect to the opposition. In February 1934, 3 days of right-wing demonstrations against alleged high-level corruption turned into a mass riot in the Place de la Concorde. As communists and ex-servicemen made common cause with fascists, a mob advanced on Parliament just across the river. The police and the Garde Mobile struggled to hold the bridge. In the chamber itself, the brand new centrist government of Edouard Daladier was seeking a vote of confidence.
Hundreds and thousands of people decided to take the Chamber of Deputies. They reached the Place de la Concorde. 200 meters away, my father gave orders to fire and stop them. They did not seize Parliament, but some people were killed and others wounded.
It took 6 hours to clear the square. 17 people were killed and over 2,000 injured. It was the bloodiest battle in the streets of Paris since the Commune in 1871. Prime Minister Daladier got his vote of confidence, but his cabinet persuaded him to resign. For the first time in this century, a government had been brought down by rioting. The battles on the streets came at an inopportune time for the French. It distracted them from larger events across the River Rhine, where years of similar disorder had brought Hitler to power. Early in 1936, Hitler marched his then insubstantial army into the demilitarized Rhineland. It was a breach of 2 treaties and a serious threat to France. The demilitarized zone was vital to the French. Not only was it a buffer, but in the event of war, their troops could cut through it quickly and attack the Ruhr. Now it was lost.
I immediately dug my heels in and said, no, it's not possible. The government won't let it happen. Tomorrow morning we'll be off. I went and got my uniform. Since I was an officer, I had my uniform at home. I went and fetched my uniform and laid it on the bed, and I said, tomorrow I'm off. The next day nothing happened. And I always regretted it because my indignation should have been felt right around France. It should have been felt by our leaders. And then we wouldn't have had what unfortunately happened next.
The Rhineland business seemed a long way off from our problems. You must remember that at that time, the workers had very serious problems, especially the problems of unemployment. There were other things to think about than what was happening to their neighbor. The main topic of conversation was their hardships.
Memory of the carnage of 1914 to 18 was one reason for France's inaction. Public opinion, reflected in the press, was opposed even to the risk of war. Even the generals were crypto-pacifists. They told the politicians that the army was organized as a static defense force to man the Maginot Line, and not for rapid offensive action. They wildly overestimated German strength, and there was no support for resistance to Hitler from Britain, where the government was flatly opposed to the engagement of British troops on the continent.
The Rhineland affair in March 1936 was a major turning point in the 1930s for French politics. Firstly, by not intervening against the Germans over the Rhineland, France lost a very large part of her international credibility. The small allies in particular didn't trust her anymore. Why should France fly to the help of the Poles or Czechs when she couldn't even defend her own interests on the Rhine? The whole system of small alliances began to decline. Moreover, France was becoming conscious of her weaknesses. She was realizing that the small alliances, useful during the 1920s, had become a burden during the 1930s.
As Germany grew stronger, France tried to court new allies. Repeatedly, the needs of national defense were frustrated by ideological conflict at home. When French leaders made approaches to fascist Italy, they aroused heated opposition on the left. And the very notion of an alliance with Russia infuriated the far right. That left Britain, but the British had put their trust in appeasement, and without consulting the French, they concluded a naval agreement with Hitler that allowed him to build a powerful fleet.
This naval agreement with the British government has been negotiated by Herr von Ribbentrop.
France's leaders were appalled that Britain was dealing with Hitler behind their backs.
Above all, they did not understand why the English were doing a juggling act, trying to maintain a balance of power in Europe between France and Germany, when Germany was becoming more and more powerful, next to an ill-equipped France who had no allies.
The gulf between the British and French widened when France showed signs of swinging to the left.
One day, my mother took me by the hand, and we went out into the street to mingle with all the people. They were all holding hands, shouting and singing, and there were a lot of words I could hear like freedom, holidays, brotherhood. And dominating everything, there was this song, the Internationale.
L'Internationale. C'est la lutte finale, groupons-nous et demain.
Camarades, des rassemblements comme celui-ci réunissent aujourd'hui des millions de prolétaires dans tout l'univers. Prenons l'engagement de ne jamais laisser passer ici le fascisme.
Il y a même une sorte de haine de classe.
There was a kind of class hatred which became firmly entrenched at the time. We could say that France quite simply lost her national cohesion because of the crisis of the 30s.
Mais plus grave, la France entre aussi.
More seriously, France had a political crisis from 1934. And this hatred in society was reflected in the political world between left and right. There were constant cries of hatred, a hatred that would now make us shiver, it was so violent.
Tellement le ton est extrêmement violent.
In May 1936, France went to the polls. Hatred of the right had united the left-wing parties. The communists, obeying an order from Stalin, invited socialist leaders to join the common cause of anti-fascism. The new Popular Front of socialists, communists and radicals outpolled the right-wing parties by 1 million votes. The election was a triumph for the workers. Twice in the previous century, revolution had brought them within reach of power. Each time the bourgeoisie had beaten them back. This was their chance to enforce reform. The socialist leader, Léon Blum, who had spent a lifetime in opposition, became prime minister. At the last moment, the communists refused to join his government.
Nous serons un gouvernement de biens publics. Nous voulons rendre confiance en elle-même à l'Europe pacifique. Nous voulons rendre confiance en elle-même à la France laborieuse.
For constitutional reasons, the new government could not take office for another 4 weeks. 2 million workers refused to wait for the promised reforms. In festive mood, they launched sit-in strikes for higher pay, shorter hours, and the right of collective bargaining.
La nuit sur l'herbe des bois, les mouches ne me piquent pas. Je suis heureux, j'ai tout et j'ai rien, je chante sur mon chemin.
The right-wing parties cried revolution. The employers gave in. Parliament enacted reforms. But these winds of change frightened investors and produced a crippling backlash. A flight of capital abroad, followed by a fall of the franc and devaluation. Soon after the Popular Front came to power, civil war broke out in Spain, where General Franco's right-wing rebels attacked Spain's Popular Front government. France divided, Léon Blum favoring intervention on the side of the Spanish left.
Camarades, chers amis, nous tous qui sommes assemblés ici, nous voulons la paix. Or, la première condition de la paix, si évidente qu'on ose à peine l'énoncer, c'est qu'aucune nation ne se trouve contrainte de défendre par les armes l'intégrité de son territoire, le libre jeu des institutions qu'elle s'est données.
But right-wing leaders argued that intervention would cause the civil war to spread to France. In face of that probability and heavy pressure from Britain, Blum retreated.
The French were more afraid of communism because they had memories of the Russian Revolution and more recently the Spanish Civil War. And they were afraid of a civil war because if the communists had come to power, it would have provoked a bloody reaction and a war between the French, a fratricidal war.
The Popular Front now adopted accelerated rearmament. Previously, the left had opposed it, but France was now threatened with encirclement by three fascist countries, Germany, Italy, and Spain. The Minister of War was Edouard Deladier, a radical.
Early in September 1936, Daladier received the military, in particular General Georges, and asked him, how many billions do you need for the 4-year plan? Georges replied, 9 billion. To which Daladier replied, you will have 14 billion. For the first time, a civilian government and a left-wing government was giving the army more than it was asking for. And I shall add something which is perhaps not very well known. When we consider the French budget, the Popular Front spent more on cannons than on butter. Why? Because they had become aware of the Hitlerian threat.
Rearmament produced another right-wing backlash. In Paris 5 years earlier, the Quadro, whose earliest members were former soldiers, had broken up a gala meeting of the International Disarmament Congress, denouncing it as pacifist. The Quadro now reversed its policy. It took the line that rearmament by a left-wing government must lead to war on behalf of communism. Again, domestic ideological disputes were tying the hands of government. Maurice Gardet was an active member of the Croix de Feu.
Let's say that, so far as I'm concerned, I can answer this question at once. My choice, if I had to choose, I would have much preferred a regime close to National Socialist fascism than to the policies of M. Léon Blum. I can tell you that straight away.
For the next 2 years, Léon Blum's Popular Front staggered from one crisis to another, its majority diluted by defections to the Conservatives. The workers made notable gains, but the bankers and financiers made the country pay heavily. The flight of capital abroad cost the economy tens of billions of francs, and France could not raise enough money to match the pace of rearmament in Germany. By 1938, the Popular Front had all but collapsed, and on March the 11th, the day Hitler took over Austria, France was without a government.
Le Parti national-socialiste autrichien fête avec éclat sa victoire. Sur toute l'étendue de l'Autriche, les manifestations, les défilés s'organisent. Les rues retentissent de cris et de chants, tandis que les premiers détachements motorisés de l'armée allemande rallient Innsbruck.
As in the case of Hitler's occupation of the Rhineland, France and Britain protested and left it at that. It was Edouard Daladier, 17 times a cabinet minister and 3 times prime minister, who took over the government. He represented the middle of the French political spectrum and was equally hostile to fascism and communism. Daladier was energetic but indecisive. His nickname was the bull with the horns of a snail.
Au nom de mon pays, je convie à une collaboration confiante toutes les puissances qui pensent comme nous, toutes celles qui, comme nous, sont prêtes à persévérer dans les voies de la paix, mais qui, d'un seul élan, se dresseraient solidaires devant l'agression.
Daladier was well aware of what Hitler's next move might be.
Quelles sont les conséquences immédiates de l'annexion de l'Autriche par l'Allemagne? La carte de l'Europe nous répond. La Tchécoslovaquie est enclavée dans une sorte d'étau. Prague, prise entre Berlin et Vienne, est à la merci d'une attaque concentrique. La frontière italienne est à la portée des canons allemands. Pour ceux qui l'ont voulu, que signifie cette annexion? Elle signifie l'étape la plus importante du vaste programme pan-germaniste que s'est fixé l'Allemagne. Ce programme prévoit l'absorption par le Troisième Reich de tous les peuples considérés comme étant de race allemande qui vivent autour de ses frontières et que les traités de 1919 ont réunis aux États voisins de l'Allemagne.
Czechoslovakia was France's principal ally in Europe. France had helped to train the Czech army and air force, and also to build a system of fortifications similar to the Maginot Line along the border with Germany. Daladier asked the French General Staff what military action France could take against Germany to help Czechoslovakia, it being understood that mobilization was only the first step.
President Daladier had been Minister of Defense for 2 years. The 1936 rearmament plan was his idea. And if anyone knew the situation of the French army, it was Daladier. Consequently, he knew every gap and every deficiency. And he was perfectly able to appreciate himself that in September 1938, the French army was certainly in no state for intervention.
By 1938, the year of the Munich crisis, the French and British prime ministers were uneasy partners. Daladier wanted to stand by his ally Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain thought the fate of one far-off little country not worth a European war. In the event, Merkel's support at home compelled Daladier to fall into step with the British. His foreign minister, Georges Bonnet, tirelessly urged appeasement, and the French generals insisted that France would be defeated, its air force wiped out and Paris destroyed.
Devant l'imminence du péril, l'évacuation de Paris commence et la défense passive s'organise. Les anciens combattants se refusent à l'idée d'un calvaire qu'ils voulaient épargner à leurs enfants.
At the Munich conference, Daladier followed Chamberlain's lead and abandoned Czechoslovakia. He told a colleague, "I shall do anything to avoid war, because we will lose it." Then Daladier signed. Etienne Crouchanel was with Daladier on the flight back to Paris.
Je me souviens très bien de cette atmosphère, l'atmosphère funèbre.
I remember the atmosphere very well, this funereal atmosphere on the plane. We felt we had suffered considerable defeat. We had accepted without a fight to let down a friend and an ally who was now having both its legs cut off. This atmosphere was so oppressive that when we arrived at Le Bourget, when we saw this huge crowd, we all thought that these people had come to hiss and boo us. And Daladier wondered if he should land at Le Bourget or elsewhere. And in the end, he said one had to face one's destiny and told the pilot to land.
Il a donné l'ordre au pilote d'atterrir. Et quand nous avons été arrêtés...
And when he stopped on the runway and the doors opened, instead of the hissing and booing that we were expecting, there was a sea of applause and enthusiasm to greet us. This was impossible for us to understand. And Daladier turned round, I can still hear him, towards the man nearest to him and said, "But these people are mad."
Et dire, ces gens sont fous.
La réaction des Français après l'accord de Munich a été un énorme soulagement.
The French people's reaction after Munich was a huge feeling of relief. Because after all, the French had been scared. Let's say that from that moment onward, they were saying peace is saved. Because the French did not want war at all, not in the least. Not one of them.
Ni les uns, ni les autres.
War had been averted, but Daladier was certain that Hitler was determined to dominate Europe by force.
Daladier signe les accords de Munich.
Daladier signed the Munich Agreement in 1938, in spite of himself.
Indeed, Daladier was not a true supporter of the policy of appeasement, unlike Neville Chamberlain. For him, only one thing counted. France was not militarily ready. In his view, it was only a means of borrowing time. He was certain that it was not possible to avoid war, but France had to be better prepared for it.
Après Munich, j'ai dit à mon père, mais pourquoi?
After Munich, I said to my father, why, I could have joined the army. Then he looked at me with a kind of look in his eye and said, rest assured you will fight it, the war, and it will last longer than you think. And that was just when he came back from Munich.
C'était juste à son retour de Munich.
A week after Munich, Daladier publicly abandoned appeasement and peace at any price.
Je suis comme vous, un fils du peuple. Et comme les hommes du peuple, il m'arrive de me demander, à la lueur du soleil couchant, si la route que j'ai prise est la meilleure et s'il n'y en a point d'autre. Mais aujourd'hui, j'ai choisi ma route. Nous voulons une république forte, une démocratie vigoureuse, capable de triompher de tous les assauts. Nous n'avons rien, croyez-moi, nous n'avons rien à redouter de ces adversaires. Si par hasard devait se produire un jour contre elles une tentative de violence, les citoyens de France, l'armée, toutes les forces vives de la nation se lèveraient pour la briser et la briseraient à l'époque.
The French government now became assertive. New taxes were imposed. Productivity was encouraged, and strikes were put down, all in the name of a surge in rearmament.
Or, la défense nationale exige des armements sans précédent dans l'histoire. Et quelle que soit l'opinion politique professée par chaque Français, il n'en est pas un qui ne veuille conserver ses biens, ses libertés, qui ne soit prêt à assurer leur défense.
Il y a en 1939, c'est très important,
There was in 1939, this is very important, a national reaction, a real awakening. What were the reasons? I think in the first place that the Munich Agreement acted as a kind of electric shock on the French. Most of them approved of the Munich Agreement. A public opinion poll, one of the first French opinion polls carried out by the IFOP, showed that 57% of the population approved of this agreement. 37%, however, were against it. It was a large minority. And more important, a little later, a second opinion poll with the following question: are you ready to grant Hitler more concessions? The answer was very clear. 70% no, 17% yes. Therefore, a change of attitude. In short, Munich was the last of the last, but not of the wars, the last concession that we would grant Hitler.
There were further meetings with the British, who disappointed the French by showing little interest in joint military planning. In the event of war, Britain would have only 2 army divisions ready for service on the continent. What brought Britain and France together was Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. They agreed that his next target was likely to be Poland, another French ally. Britain announced a formal guarantee of Poland's independence.
Consequently, England gave its word to Poland and Romania, and wished for closer links with France. Military talks took place all through the spring, very actively, very amicably. The atmosphere between France and England changed completely from the beginning of 1939, because there was a strong common purpose, which was to stop Hitler from conquering the world and imposing his abominable regime.
I received an invitation to the 14th of July parade in 1939. I went along. It was absolutely superb. It was the army of the Second Empire. There were white cuirassiers, blue cuirassiers, red cuirassiers, and some English as well, wearing fur busbies. It was a bit old-fashioned. As I was arriving, I saw 6 modern bomber planes flying. Leo 45 models, and I thought, they're the last ones. There must have been more. And the following day, I went to the War Ministry to gather some information and found that they were the only ones. In 1939, we already had some modern fighters, perhaps 300, but no modern bombers, only 6. A few more in 1940, but not a lot more. In 1939, when we entered the war, we had 500 worthwhile modern planes. England 1,500 and Germany 3,500.
In August 1939, Britain and France made a last and belated attempt to find an ally who could help stop Hitler. They sent a joint mission to Moscow. But the Germans forestalled them, and with the signing of the Nazi-Soviet pact, Poland was at the mercy of either or both.
Vous me connaissez assez pour savoir qu'afin de conjurer la guerre, je ferai tout ce qu'il est humainement possible de faire, avec la liberté et avec la vie de la Pologne, c'est-à-dire avec la liberté et la vie de 33 millions d'êtres humains. C'est le destin des autres peuples de l'Europe qui est lui-même mis en cause. Mais si tous nos efforts demeuraient inutiles, nous ferions appel, Françaises et Français, à votre courage, à votre volonté de ne pas subir la servitude. Françaises et Français, je n'ai aucun besoin de vous tracer votre devoir. Je sais que vous êtes résolus à assurer par tous les sacrifices le salut de la patrie.
Je me rappelle très bien. I clearly remember that a French couturier, a Parisian, produced in 1939 some belts which have been embroidered with, "Let's get it over with, let's get it over with, let's get it over with." Which means that when the people realized they could not avoid war, then they said to themselves, well, let's get on with it.
La lutte désespérée de la Pologne sera une des plus héroïques pages de l'histoire de tous les temps, une tâche honteuse et indélébile dans celle des peuples agresseurs.
Germany went to war against Poland on September the 1st. France and Britain waited 2 days to declare war on Germany. They were to do nothing that directly helped the Poles. For that, neither was ready. In the final days of the peace, France was still not united. Even Daladier's cabinet was divided. His foreign minister, Georges Bonnet, tried desperately to keep France out of the conflict and appease her to the last. By 1939, most Frenchmen were not.
Les gens étaient convaincus. People were convinced that in 3 months France would annihilate Germany. The young men went off making plans for a quick return.
Sauf les mères, les femmes.
But not the mothers, the women, and the older people who could still remember the stories of the 1914-18 war, and who had on the war memorial of every town the name of someone close to them, who they were still mourning for.
Vous, mes amis, mes souvenirs, si vous la voyez revenir, dites-lui que mon cœur lassé vient de rompre avec le passé.
Where Strasbourg had been the first border city to be reoccupied by the French in 1918, it was now the first to evacuate its civilians.
Everybody was upset, and it was sad to see all those old people with a suitcase and not many things, mothers with their children in their arms. But everyone was sure that it wouldn't be for long, that they were leaving, but that they would soon be freed once again. but the French would very soon be back.
Dites-lui, voulez-vous, bonjour pour moi, et voilà tout.
Après 1919, la France n'a jamais pris le chemin de la guerre.
After 1919, France never again took the road to war. In fact, France was in no position to think in terms of war after 1914-18. Her sacrifice had been so great. France could not afford the luxury of another war. She was demographically and financially weakened. Finally, pacifism did not emanate from the left. It was a gut pacifism, found in all parts of society, across the whole political spectrum. France only followed the road to peace. But the truth is that this road to peace led in the end to war.
Le gouvernement allemand déclare solennellement au gouvernement français.
Only 9 months later, the road ended in defeat. In sadness and astonishment, Frenchmen listened to Germany's terms for an armistice. Their country had failed to beat back another German invasion. 20 years of strife and decline had taken their toll.
Vis-à-vis de la flotte française lors de la conclusion de la paix.
We'll continue the road to war in Mussolini's Italy next Sunday at 8:30. Next on ABC, Franco Nero stars as Garibaldi, the general.